It's 2 in the morning, and you're sound asleep, legs curled under the blanket, feet pointed downward the way they naturally fall when you're lying on your side. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, the muscle in the back of your calf seizes into something that feels like a fist made of rope. Your eyes snap open. Your foot is curled and locked, and no amount of willpower can make it let go. You're gasping, maybe swearing, trying to stand on a leg that currently belongs to someone else. If that scene is familiar, you're in enormous company, and by the end of this, you're going to understand something about it that almost nobody does. Something that sounds nearly unbelievable the first time you hear it. A spoonful of ordinary pickle juice, or a small dab of yellow mustard, can make that cramp let go in under a minute. Faster than any fluid or mineral you swallow could possibly travel from your stomach into your bloodstream and out to your leg. That single fact, confirmed in a real laboratory, quietly undoes almost everything you've been told about why this happens. This isn't going to be another video telling you to drink more water or eat a banana before bed. That advice isn't wrong because it's lazy. It's wrong because it's aimed at the wrong organ entirely. By the time we're done, you'll know exactly which system in your body actually misfires at 2 in the morning, why that system gets shakier the older we get, and what to do about it that lines up with how your nervous system actually works, rather than how folk wisdom guessed it might. Let's start with what you can verify yourself, tonight, with your own hand. Touch a calf that's mid-cramp, and it doesn't feel like a muscle that's sore after a hard walk. It feels like stone. You can watch the shape of it change, the muscle visibly balling up under the skin, sometimes into a hard, defined lump you could trace with a finger. That's your first clue, and it's a bigger one than it looks. Most of these episodes, by the way, run their course in well under 10 minutes, though an especially stubborn one can occasionally drag on far longer. A muscle that's simply tired is still, structurally, a relaxed muscle. It aches, it resists movement, but you can move it. A cramping muscle is doing something entirely different. It's actively, forcefully contracted, held that way by continuous effort, the same way your bicep looks and feels when you consciously flex it as hard as you can, except you never decided to flex your calf. Nobody sent that order, or so it seems. Here's the part almost everyone misses on their first pass through this topic. Your muscles cannot decide anything. A single muscle fiber, left completely alone, cannot contract itself. It's extraordinary tissue, but entirely passive, like a rope. Ropes don't pull themselves taut. Something has to pull them, and in your body, that something is never the muscle. It's always a nerve. So if the muscle has no ambition of its own, and yet it's clenched into a fist at 2 in the morning, the interesting question stops being, what's wrong with my calf, and becomes, who told it to do that, and why won't they stop? That's the real mystery, and it's a nervous system mystery, not a muscle mystery, which is exactly why rubbing the muscle, stretching it in a panic, or drinking a glass of water so often treats the symptom without ever touching the source. To understand who's giving the order, you need one piece of wiring, and it's simpler than it sounds. Every muscle in your body is divided into work crews. Each crew is made of anywhere from a handful to a couple thousand individual muscle fibers, and every crew answers to exactly one boss, a single nerve cell called a motor neuron, whose body sits in your spinal cord and whose long, thin fiber runs all the way down your leg to reach its crew. Physiologists call the boss and crew combination a motor unit. You can just picture a foreman and his workers. Here's the elegant part. The foreman doesn't negotiate or send partial instructions. When he shouts, "Pull," every worker in his crew pulls, together, instantly, at full strength. There's no such thing as a muscle fiber that pulls a little bit. It either fires or it doesn't. Your calf can produce anything from a gentle push on a bicycle pedal to a full sprint only because you have hundreds of these foreman and crew units, and your brain simply decides how many foremen to wake up and how fast to have them shout. And critically, after the foreman shouts, he's supposed to go quiet. Silence is the default. The crew relaxes the instant the shouting stops, because a muscle fiber has no ability to stay contracted on its own. It needs continuous, repeated signaling to stay locked down, the same way a light bulb stays lit only as long as current keeps flowing to it. Cut the signal, and the light and the contraction goes out immediately. And here's the piece that changes everything. A cramp is what happens when a foreman gets stuck, not a jammed muscle, a nerve cell that starts firing over and over, rapidly, without the normal pause, shouting pull, 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 pull 10, 20, 30 times a second, far faster than any voluntary contraction, and refusing to stop. The crew has no choice but to obey every shout, because there's no gap between the shouts long enough to relax in. From the outside, that looks like one long, unbroken, agonizing contraction lasting anywhere from a few seconds to several unbearable minutes. From the muscle's point of view, it's simply doing its job extremely well on an order that should never have been given. This isn't a metaphor dressed up as science. Researchers have actually watched it happen with electrodes. Back in 1994, the physiologists Baldessera, Cavallari, and Dworzak published work in the journal Brain describing what they called motor neuron bistability, the discovery that under the right conditions, a motor neuron can flip into a self-sustaining, rapid-firing state and effectively get stuck there, the electrical equivalent of a foreman who's lost the ability to stop talking. 15 years later, in 2009, researchers led by Magneto used fine electrodes to record individual motor units in the small muscles of the foot while cramps were deliberately, briefly triggered in willing volunteers, publishing their results in the Journal of Neurophysiology. What they recorded matched the beastability idea almost perfectly. During a cramp, the motor neuron fires in a rapid, regular, repeating pattern, completely unlike anything seen in a normal voluntary contraction. This is not muscle weakness. This is not muscle damage. It's a communication error happening one level up, in the wiring, not the workforce. So why would a foreman get stuck shouting? The honest answer is that scientists are still debating exactly where along the path the misfire originates, whether right at the tiny nerve ending buried inside the muscle itself, or further up, closer to the spinal cord. But the conditions that make it more likely are well documented, and they line up beautifully with what you already know from experience. A shortened muscle is far more prone to this than a lengthened one, and think about how your calf sits for hours every single night. Your foot naturally drops downward under the weight of a blanket, which is close to the most shortened position your calf muscle can be in. A shortened muscle's internal stretch sensors, called muscle spindles, sit slack and understimulated, and a slack spindle provides less of the steady background signal that normally helps keep a motor neuron's firing rate calm and stable. Fatigue does something similar. A muscle that's been asked to do more than usual during the day, a long walk, a new exercise, a few hours on a ladder, comes into the night already closer to that unstable tipping point. There's a reason this problem is so specifically nocturnal, and it's not just about the blanket. During an ordinary day, simply walking pushes your foot through a full range of motion with almost every step, your toes lifting toward your shin each time your heel leaves the ground. That movement repeatedly stretches the calf and refreshes those stretch sensors dozens of times an hour without you ever noticing it happening. At night, that stops completely. You might go 7 or 8 hours without your calf muscle being lengthened even once, which is a genuinely unusual, prolonged state for a muscle that almost never sits still that long across a normal day. Some researchers have pointed out, half historically and half speculatively, that this may be a distinctly modern problem. People who spend part of their day resting in a deep squat, a position still common in many parts of the world and for most of human history, put the calf through a long, passive stretch that a lifetime of chairs and beds simply doesn't provide. It's a softer piece of the puzzle than anything else we've covered tonight, more hypothesis than proven fact, but it fits the same pattern. Whatever else is going on, uninterrupted shortening seems to be part of what sets the stage. Here's something worth sitting with. This single insight already explains something you've probably experienced without ever understanding why. Forcing your toes hard toward your shin during a cramp works almost immediately, while sitting still and waiting for it to pass takes agonizing minutes. You're not loosening anything by pulling your toes up. You're forcibly lengthening the shortened muscle, waking its stretch sensors back up, and handing that stuck, rapid-firing foreman a competing, stronger signal that starts to break his loop. Hold that thought, because it's your first real tool, and we're coming back to it. But there's a bigger question sitting underneath all of this, and it's the one that actually explains why this video exists at all. Why does this happen to some people constantly and others almost never? And why, specifically, does it get so much more common after 50? This isn't a small effect. In one of the more careful surveys on the subject, Abdullah and colleagues studied 365 outpatients over the age of 65, average age just under 79, and published their results in the International Journal of Clinical Practice back in 1999. Half of them, 50%, reported having leg cramps. Women reported them more often than men, and the large majority said their cramps struck specifically at night. Other surveys, in other countries, land in a similar range, generally somewhere between a third and half of people past 60. This is one of the most common physical complaints of getting older, and yet almost nobody's doctor ever fully explains why. It's worth being precise about what we're actually discussing, too, because there's a different nighttime leg condition that gets confused with this one constantly: restless leg syndrome, which involves an urge to move the legs along with uncomfortable, crawling sensations that ease with movement. It shares a bedroom and a bit of overlapping terminology with nocturnal cramping, but it's a separate condition with a different profile, and one review of European survey data found it's actually the less common of the two, affecting roughly 7% of some populations compared with about 24% for nocturnal cramps in the same data. If a doctor or a well-meaning friend has ever mixed the two up, that happens more than you'd think. And the risk of the cramps we're actually talking about doesn't plateau at 65. Other surveys that track prevalence by age find it keeps climbing into the 80s, past 50% in some samples. It's also a strikingly under-discussed problem. In the 1999 survey we just mentioned, fewer than half of the people suffering from cramps had ever actually mentioned it to their doctor, and of those who did, just over half received any treatment at all. That's not a criticism of anyone. Nobody teaches you that a stuck nerve cell is worth bringing up at a checkup, which is part of why one of the practical steps toward the end of this is going to matter more than you'd expect. Here's the deeper layer, and it's genuinely one of the more elegant findings in the whole field of aging physiology. Remember, every crew needs exactly one foreman. But foreman, motor neurons, die off gradually over a lifetime, an attrition that picks up noticeably after about age 60. When a foreman dies, his crew doesn't sit abandoned. Nearby, still living foremen send out new connections and take over some or all of the orphaned muscle fibers, the way a supervisor might absorb a neighboring team after a colleague retires. Researchers who've directly measured this in human leg muscles have found that by around age 70, a healthy person has roughly 40% fewer motor neurons than they did as a young adult, and the survivors have swelled to compensate, each now commanding, on average, about 50% more muscle fibers than before. Think about what that means for the system we just walked through. You no longer have lean, focused foremen each overseeing a modest, familiar crew. You have fewer foremen, each managing a larger, more sprawling team, patched together from several original crews with different histories and different wiring. A supervisor covering 3 departments instead of 1 is more likely to have a bad night, lose track of who's doing what, and occasionally fire off an instruction that doesn't get properly cancelled. That's not a certainty for any one person, and it isn't the only thing going on. But it lines up remarkably well with the pattern we actually see. Cramps that were rare at 30 and routine at 70, in a nervous system that is measurably, verifiably more stretched at the motor neuron level than it used to be. This is a wiring story, not a wear and tear on the muscle story, and that distinction is about to matter enormously for what you actually do about it. Which brings us to the advice you've almost certainly already tried, and why it so often doesn't work. For decades, the standard explanation for night cramps has been dehydration or a mineral shortfall. Not enough potassium, not enough calcium, and especially not enough magnesium. It's a tidy story, and not a crazy one to reach for, because minerals genuinely do affect how excitable a nerve cell is. The trouble is that when researchers actually test it in controlled trials, the story mostly falls apart for the everyday nighttime cramps this video is about. Take magnesium, the most heavily marketed of the bunch. Garrison and colleagues at the University of British Columbia conducted a systematic review for the Cochrane collaboration, the gold standard for weighing medical evidence, pooling the available randomized trials, most recently updated in 2020. For ordinary, unexplained nighttime cramps in older adults, the largest and most studied group, the difference between magnesium and an inactive placebo pill was small and not statistically meaningful. A separate, well-designed trial published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2017, led by Noga Rogan Maur and colleagues in Israel, tested magnesium oxide against placebo directly and reached the same conclusion: no significant benefit. That doesn't mean magnesium is worthless for every single person alive. Someone with a genuine, diagnosed deficiency is a different situation entirely. But for the average older adult with routine nighttime calf cramps, the evidence isn't there, and it hasn't been there for a while. So if a mineral shortage isn't the real driver, why does this advice persist so stubbornly? Partly because cramps come and go on their own, regardless of what you do, so almost any remedy looks like it's working about half the time, purely by chance. And partly because, as you now know, the actual site of the malfunction is a nerve cell, not a starved muscle fiber. You cannot fix a communication error in the wiring by topping up a nutrient in the workshop. It's the wrong department entirely. There's a second, more sobering version of this same mistake, and it involves quinine, an old malaria drug that was, for decades, the default prescription for night cramps. It does work, modestly. A Cochrane review of 23 trials found roughly a 28% reduction in cramp frequency compared to placebo, which is a real effect. But quinine also carries a rare risk of a serious blood disorder called thrombocytopenia, along with dangerous heart rhythm problems, and in the summer of 2010, the Food and Drug Administration issued a formal safety warning after reviewing dozens of serious adverse event reports, some fatal, tied specifically to its off-label use for leg cramps. The agency's conclusion, in essence, was that the risk was too high a price for treating a condition that's painful but not dangerous. It's a sobering reminder that it sort of works, and it's worth the risk, are two very different questions, especially for a problem that, as you're about to see, has a far safer answer sitting in your kitchen. Now let's go back to the fact I promised you at the start, because this is where the nervous system explanation stops being a theory and becomes something you can practically watch happen. In 2010, a researcher named Kevin Miller and his team at North Dakota State University set out to test something that had circulated for years as pure folklore among athletic trainers: that a small amount of pickle juice could stop a muscle cramp almost immediately. Rather than just asking people, they induced real, painful cramps in the small muscles of volunteers' feet using mild electrical stimulation, a method that lets researchers trigger a cramp on demand and measure exactly how long it lasts. Afterward, some volunteers drank a measured dose of pickle juice, others drank plain water. The pickle juice group's cramps stopped meaningfully faster. Here's the detail that makes this finding so powerful. The study's own introduction notes that people had long reported relief within about 35 seconds of that first swallow, and the research team could show that 35 seconds is nowhere near enough time for anything you swallow to be absorbed from your stomach, enter your bloodstream, and travel out to a cramping muscle in your foot. They checked. Blood, sodium, and other electrolyte levels in the pickle juice drinkers hadn't meaningfully moved in that window. Whatever was happening, it wasn't rehydration, and it wasn't replacing a mineral. Their conclusion, published in the journal Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, was that the relief came from a reflex, a signal triggered by the sour, sharp taste itself, starting in the back of the mouth and throat, racing up a nerve pathway, and coming back down to directly quiet the overactive motor neuron. Researchers who followed up on this work showed that other intensely sour or pungent tastes, including plain vinegar and yellow mustard, which share some of the same chemical triggers, produce a similar calming effect through what are called TORP channels. Sensors in your mouth and throat, the very same family of sensors that make a chili pepper feel hot or a strong mint feel cold, wired directly into pathways that can dial down an overexcited nerve. This wasn't a one-off finding, either. In 2017, a separate research team led by Daniel Craighead tested whether swallowing a concentrated blend of these same kinds of plant compounds, extracts of cinnamon, ginger, and chili pepper, could reduce cramps triggered by exercise, publishing their results in the journal Muscle and Nerve. It produced a similar calming effect, which reinforces something important. The active ingredient in all of these old folk remedies was never really the food itself. It was always which nerve receptors that food happened to switch on. Sit with what that actually proves. It isn't just that pickle juice happens to help. It's that the fastest, most reliable at-home fix we have real evidence for works by talking directly to the nervous system through your mouth, nowhere near the cramping muscle itself. That's about as clean a confirmation as you could ask for that the entire event, start to finish, is a nerve story. The muscle was never the problem. It was only ever following extremely loud, very specific instructions. So here's where we land, and it changes what's actually worth doing about this. If a cramp is a stuck, overexcited foreman rather than a tired or depleted muscle, then the useful interventions are the ones that either calm that foreman down before he gets stuck or interrupt him quickly once he does, not the ones aimed at feeding or massaging the crew. Knowing that, here's what's actually worth your time, and every one of these connects directly back to something we just walked through, not to generic wellness advice. First, and this has the best evidence behind it of anything we'll discuss, stretch your calves and hamstrings for a minute or two, every night, right before you get into bed. Not randomly during the day, specifically right before sleep. In a randomized trial published in the Journal of Physiotherapy in 2012, Hallegraaf and colleagues in the Netherlands took 80 adults over 55 with regular nocturnal cramps and had half of them do exactly this for 6 weeks, while the other half changed nothing. The stretching group ended up with, on average, just over 1 fewer cramp per night than the control group, and the cramps they still had hurt noticeably less. Why would this work, given everything we now know? Remember those slack, understimulated stretch sensors sitting in a chronically shortened calf muscle. A deliberate nightly stretch keeps those sensors active right before the muscle spends 8 hours in its most vulnerable, foot-drooped position, essentially keeping a small, steady, calming signal running to that foreman before he's ever given the chance to get stuck. That's a genuinely strong, well-replicated result for something that costs nothing and takes about 90 seconds. Second, when a cramp does hit, and even with nightly stretching, some still will, do exactly what your body is probably already telling you to do, but do it more deliberately. Grab your toes or the ball of your foot and pull them firmly up toward your shin, or stand and press your heel flat into the floor while leaning forward. This isn't about brute forcing the muscle into submission. It's a targeted, forceful stretch of the exact muscle that's cramping, which does 2 things at once. It mechanically lengthens the shortened fibers, and it recruits a separate protective reflex, centered on sensors in the tendon itself, whose entire job is to prevent a muscle from contracting too hard by sending an inhibitory signal back to that same motor neuron. You're essentially handing the stuck foreman a louder, more urgent countermand than the one he's stuck repeating. That's why deliberately stretching it out usually beats simply waiting, rubbing, or walking it off. Those don't send anywhere near as strong a competing signal. Third, and this is the one people find hardest to believe until they've tried it, keep a small amount of pickle juice, or even a spoonful of plain yellow mustard, within reach of your bed. At the first sign of a cramp, take a small mouthful or a spoonful and let the sharp, sour taste sit for a few seconds before swallowing. Based on what we now understand from Miller's research and the work that followed it, this isn't a home remedy in the vague, old wives' tale sense. It's a targeted way of triggering that same nerve-calming reflex through your mouth and throat, which for some people arrives faster than a physical stretch can, especially if a cramp strikes somewhere harder to reach or stretch effectively, like the arch of your foot or your thigh. A small container by the nightstand costs almost nothing, and for many people works within roughly the same short window the original research described. Fourth, and this one is less about a nightly ritual and more about a single, worthwhile conversation. If your cramps are frequent, severe, or started suddenly after years of having none, it's worth mentioning to your doctor, specifically asking whether anything on your medication list might be a contributor. Remember that overworked foreman picture from earlier. Certain medications appear to tip that same excitable system further in the wrong direction. Garrison and colleagues in British Columbia tracked prescription and treatment records for over 4 million people over nearly a decade and found that new cramp treatment became substantially more common in the year after people started certain diuretics, specifically the potassium-sparing and thiazide-like types, or inhaled long-acting bronchodilators used for asthma and COPD. Medications aren't the only thing on that list worth ruling out, either. Conditions that irritate the nerve roots feeding your leg, such as narrowing of the lower spine, or that affect circulation and nerve health more broadly, such as vascular disease or diabetes, have also been linked to more frequent cramping for the same underlying reason. Anything that adds extra irritation to that nerve pathway can tip an already borderline system further over the edge. None of this means you should assume the worst. Most nighttime cramps happen to people with nothing else wrong at all. But it's exactly why a 5-minute conversation with your doctor is worth more than another bottle of supplements. This doesn't mean stopping a medication on your own. Some of these drugs are doing essential work elsewhere in your body, and the decision about whether an alternative makes sense belongs to you and your doctor together. But the conversation is worth having, and now you can walk in with a specific, useful question instead of a vague complaint. So picture that 2 in the morning moment one more time, except now, run it forward with everything you know. Your calf locks up, and for a half second there's still that flash of alarm. But somewhere underneath it, a different, calmer thought is available to you now, one that wasn't there before tonight. This is not your muscle failing you. It's not 30 years of standing on hard floors finally catching up with your legs, and it's not a magnesium tablet you forgot to take. It's a single, overworked nerve cell, one of thousands quietly running your body's most repetitive job, momentarily caught in a loop. And loops, unlike damage, can be interrupted. There's something worth sitting with in that, beyond just the practical fix. So much of what unsettles us about getting older is the sense that our bodies are simply wearing down in ways we can't understand or influence. A slow, silent erosion with no story attached to it, just decline. But this particular story has an ending you can act on tonight. The nerve cell running your calf muscle has been firing correctly for every step you've taken across 70 or 80 years, coordinating a job of staggering complexity you've never once had to consciously think about. The rare night it stutters isn't evidence the system is failing. It's a small, sharp reminder of how much invisible, precise coordination your nervous system has been quietly pulling off for your entire life, and how, even now, it's still listening for the right signal to let go. Most of what your body does well, you never get to notice, precisely because it's going right. It's only in the stumble, the 2 in the morning jolt, that the machinery becomes visible at all, if only for a minute. That's not nothing. A body that occasionally shows you its wiring, even in pain, is still a body worth paying attention to. Understand what that stuck foreman is actually asking for, and you'll know exactly what to hand back to him. A stretch, a sharp taste, or the right question for your doctor, instead of another glass of water and a long, confused wait for morning.